Hello, and welcome to MetSpeaks, Karl Bodmer. As our ongoing lecture and conversation program, MetSpeaks always brings together a rich spectrum of voices and speakers on our special exhibitions and permanent collection. My name is Ann Meisinger, and I'm an assistant educator for public programs and creative practice at the Met. I am privileged to be speaking to you from the ancestral homelands of the Canarsie people and respectfully acknowledge the Met's location in Lapanoking, the homeland of the Lenape diaspora and historically a gathering and trading place for many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work on the island. Today's program, which is being presented in conjunction with the exhibition Karl Bodmer, North American Portraits, on view at the Met Fifth Avenue from April 5th to July 25th, 2021. The exhibition features Bodmer's watercolor paintings of the landscape of the North American interior and its indigenous peoples made during an expedition to the northwestern reaches of the Missouri River in 1833 and 34. All of the Karl Bodmer works you'll see during today's talk are in the collection of the Joslyn Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. It's my honor to introduce Patricia Marroquin Norby, Associate Curator of Native American Art in the Met's American Wing, who will be introducing today's speakers and co-moderating the conversation with Annika Johnson, Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Joslyn Art Museum. Patricia oversees the American Wing's Native American Art Collection. An award-winning scholar and museum leader, she previously served as Senior Executive and Assistant Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American Indian, New York, and as the Director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry in Chicago. Her forthcoming book, Water, Bones, and Bombs, examines 20th century American Indian art and environmental disputes in northern New Mexico. A warm welcome to Patricia and all of today's speakers.
Hello, I'm Patricia Marroquin Norby, Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Met. I'm delighted to introduce our three guests today, Gerard Baker, Scott Manning Stevens, and Annika Johnson. All three have contributed extensively to the current exhibition, Karl Bodmer, North American Portraits, on view in the Met's American Wing. Each of our guests has also written for the stunningly beautiful exhibition catalog, Faces from the Interior, the North American Portraits of Karl Bodmer, which will be discussed in this program. Gerard Baker is a full-blood member of the Mandan Hidatsa tribe and the highest-ranking American Indian in National Park Service history. He is also widely recognized as a public figure throughout Indian country for his work as a mediator and facilitator between the service and tribal governments. Gerard was born on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in Mandan, North Dakota. Growing up in a traditional Indian home on his father's cattle ranch, he spent time breaking horses, running cattle, and doing chores. At night, he listened to stories told by his family members and tribal elders about the survival of his people and culture. Scott Manning Stevens is a citizen of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation and director of the Native American and Indigenous Studies program at Syracuse University. There, he also teaches courses in the departments of English and Art History. He earned his PhD in English from Harvard University. Stevens was formerly director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. His recent publications include essays on Haudenosaunee art in the modern era. He is author and co-author of extensive publications on Native American art and visual culture. Annika Johnson is the Associate Curator of Native American Art at Joslyn Art Museum. She specializes in 19th century Native American art of the Upper Missouri and Mississippi River regions and was awarded her doctorate in art history from the University of Pittsburgh in 2019. Community engagement is central to her work as a curator. Her research has been supported by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and the Mellon Foundation. Welcome to our guests. And now I'd like to hand this over to my colleague, Annika Johnson.
Thanks so much, Patricia, and welcome, Scott and Gerard. We are so happy that you're here with us today. I'll share a little bit about the exhibition. Karl Bodmer, North American Portraits, features 35 portraits, along with 6 landscapes and genre scenes and several related aquatints made by the Swiss-born artist Karl Bodmer during his round-trip journey from St. Louis to the northwestern reaches of the Missouri River. The exhibition's layout follows the Missouri River's pathway through the tribal lands of the Omaha, Lakota, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Blackfoot, among many Plains nations where Bodmer painted watercolor portraits of community members in situ. Bodmer was hired by the German explorer and naturalist Maximilian, Prince of Wied-Neuwied, to accompany him on an expedition to the North American interior. And he is one of the most accomplished artists to document Indigenous peoples whose homelands reside along the Missouri River. The two departed Holland in 1832, landing in Boston on July 4th of that year, and they made their way to major coastal cities and through the Midwest along the Ohio River, arriving in St. Louis in May of 1833. From there, they traveled up the Missouri River via steamboat and keelboat, as far northwest as Fort McKenzie in present-day Montana. A meticulous draftsman, Bodmer's portraits are notable for their sensitivity of depiction and subtle, refined brushwork. Bodmer's precise observation of his sitters in facial likeness, body decoration, and regalia conveys eyewitness testimony to the lives of specific individuals. Maximilian's handwritten journals, one of which is also featured in the exhibition, recorded his impressions of topography, flora, and fauna, as well as the dynamics of cultural encounters with and between Native communities and Euro-American fur traders and government agents that the travelers encountered. Indigenous scholars, artists, and tribal elders from communities visited by Bodmer and Maximilian have written texts that are featured throughout this exhibition, including a text by Gerard Baker. Highlighting the diverse histories, beliefs, and practices embodied in the portraits, these authors offer insights into the power of the images as visual legacies. The Met and Joslyn are very grateful for their participation. The exhibition's accompanying catalog features a lead essay written by Scott Stevens. Titled The Achievement of Karl Bodmer, Scott details the artist's early life and training in Europe and situates him within the corpus of visual depictions of Native American individuals by Europeans, giving us a much broader context for Bodmer and the ways in which his images are valued and interpreted. For the catalog, I had the pleasure of traveling to Gerard Baker's ranch in Montana to spend several days discussing Bodmer's time among the Mandan and Hidatsa people. So for this interview, I pulled up high-res images of Bodmer's watercolors on my computer, and Gerard pored over the images, noting several new observations, sharing stories, and reflecting on the changes that have happened since Bodmer's time. And that interview has been edited, and it's also part of the catalog. So, Gerard, I'd like to start this conversation off with a question for you. That's a pretty simple one. How did you encounter Bodmer for the first time, and what were your initial impressions of his watercolors?
All right, thank you very much, and it's so good to be here. Again, just to reintroduce myself a little bit, my traditional name, by the way, is Zetsashirish, which means yellow wolf. And my generation is the first generation to be, and the words I use are ousted from the Missouri River bottoms by the dam, by the Garrison Dam that was started by the Pick Sloan project with the Corps of Engineers. And so my generation never got to see that bottom, but what we did get to see and what we did get to hear and what we did get to experience was almost in a way the remnants of the traditional days. And the reason I say that is because when we first moved out of the bottom, my dad built a log house. Of course, him and my mom built, he helped with he built a log house. and got things ready, which meant that we had no electricity and we had no running water for about the first 4 or 5 years I was there after I was born. And so in like the traditional days, the way we had entertainment, if you want to call it that, and learning opportunities was to hear the old people come into our place and hear them speak, hear them talk about the societies, hear them talk about our clans. I belong to the Apuka Wicca clan, which is the Locat clan, and we're matrilineal, so it comes from my mother's side. And so I never did see Bodmer's prints. I never did see any of his paintings, but I heard about the people he and the outfits they wore and the medicines they kept and some of the ceremonies that were remembered from the old days. And so the first time I really ran into, if you want to call it, face to face with Karl Bodmer and of course Prince Maximilian, is when I got my first job at with the National Park Service at Awadegechu, which is where he was at. And the translation for that is the Knife River Villages or the 5 Villages. And so it was actually very stunning for me. I remember it put the words to pictures and the pictures to words. And so that's the first time I ran across that, just the pictures themselves. But remembering the stories, remembering the old men and the old women that were at our house talking about these people, talking about the societies, talking about war deeds, talking about horse borrowing situations. Of course, we call it horse thieving nowadays. And so when I did see the prints, like I said, then it put it together for me. And it was even more special for me because I was at Knife River working, and that's where Bodmer was. That's where our people were for centuries, of course. Then Bodmer came in, and so that was a real eye opener. It was a real thrill for me, and it put a lot of the pictures and the stories together.
Thanks so much.
Scott, I'd like to talk about some of Bodmer's earlier moments in his journey. He was a very young artist in his early 20s, visiting the Americas for the first time, encountering peoples and places he had never seen before. In fact, the Plains communities were not the first Indigenous peoples Bodmer connected with. Earlier in his trip, he also met members of Sauk and Fox, Potawatomi, and others as well. I wondered if you could say a few things about these earlier exchanges.
Sure, and thank you for having me here. Also, I'm a bit about my community. So I'm Akwesasne Mohawk from what is now called upstate New York, and my Mohawk name is Kolonyak Dache, Bear Clan. Again, matrilineal people. So I'm delighted to be here and talking about the context of this artist looking at Native American life for the first time in his young life. And one of the things that struck me in working on the research I was doing about Bodmer's journey is that whatever pictures he had in his mind about what he was going to encounter, the first people he encountered, native people he encountered, were not actually the people of the Upper Great Plains, but people that were in a refugee situation. Right? This is the years he's traveling. This is just a few years after the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 by the U.S. Congress, which was forcing Native people from their homes in the east, west, across the Mississippi, many of them going toward what was designated Indian Territory, what today we call Oklahoma. And in his watercolors, I was particularly struck by a series he does, maybe only 6 or so, when he takes a side trip. Maximilian is ill at one point when they're in Indiana, in New Harmony, Indiana. And while Maximilian is recovering, Bodmer takes the opportunity to go down the Mississippi to New Orleans. And it's there that he encounters these Choctaw refugees, let's call them, these people displaced from their homelands further east, probably stopping along the way, as it were, in New Orleans, and are going to be eventually relocated to Indian Territory. And he does these very delicate, small, on-the-spot watercolors. And I was just struck by even there, when it's not the kind of glorious representation of some of the wonderful regalia and clothing and decor of the native people of the Upper Plains. I mean, we are talking about a community greatly in distress, but they have this innate kind of dignity to them that I found really moving about them. And so I know that I want to return to those images well on their own. And I think of them in the context of other travelers, European and settler travelers in the East and near Midwest, say through Potawatomi country in the Illinois, Indiana region, where we have Potawatomi removal and the so-called Potawatomi Trail of Death that they're marched on. And there's an English artist around the same period named George Winter, who also does these just really striking images of people that are from those communities, the Potawatomi communities, leaders in those communities. And like Bodmer, I feel like he's giving us what he sees. He's not packaging a notion of Indianness or what an authentic anybody looks like. He's looking at these people in their very hybrid style clothing. Most of them wear cloth shirts and jackets. Some wear turbans out of calico material in the Potawatomi thing. But that's that was life of that time period. They had considerable contact with settler communities at that point. And there's a moment in time that he captures that I find really compelling. So that's part of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. I'd like to follow up my question with one more question, and that is, why do you think these Midwestern images don't get as much attention?
I think part of it is they don't fulfill what a lot of white or settler audiences want from a picture of Native America, right? They want whatever this notion of authenticity, a word, as you know, I hate, whatever this notion of, the pure, the original, the authentic, Native people in the East and in the near Midwest were not fulfilling that fantasy for the audience. So they don't want to see them wearing a cloth jacket and so on. They want the buckskin and they want the full war bonnet, regardless of tribal affiliation. And it's part of fulfilling stereotypes. And these are not as consumer friendly an object for those audiences looking for the exotic, the distant, the untouched. Even though, of course, the Native people that he encountered in Gerard's community had been in contact with whites for a long time, but it's just that fantasy of, purity and so on. And I think that people just don't care about those images for that reason. I mean, George Winter produced a lot of images that are invaluable to recording Potawatomi life in the 1830s, but that doesn't fulfill a desire for always the Native on the frontier, not the Native behind it. So, thanks.
I think that's so important, Scott, to note the changes that were well underway by the time that Maximilian and Bodmer traveled from the East Coast and up the Missouri River, which of course had taken place in the Mandan and Hidatsa villages too. Those communities were really at the heart of the fur trade. So I want to kind of bring us up the Missouri River and talk a little bit about what living in the Earth Lodge villages looked like at this point in time. So Gerard, I'm wondering if you can speak to this period when Maximilian and Bodmer were staying at Fort Clark. So this was the winter of 1833 to 34. And they spent time with the Mandan and Hidatsa families in the Earth Lodge communities. And this was the most extensive time that they spent. with any communities during their journey. So can you tell us a bit what life looked like in the villages and how Bodmer and Maximilian fit into that picture?
You bet. First of all, it was a very unique time for the Mandan Hidatsa. You have to understand that at that time, we were represented by 5 different villages or 5 different sub-tribes. We had the Awadicha, the Awaka'awi, and the Hidatsa were the 3 best known of the Hidatsas villages. Of the Mandan villages we knew of from oral history perspective, we have Nupta and Nuptari. In 1833, this time period finds the Mandans and the Hidatsas coming back from a very devastating smallpox epidemic that took place in 1781. The 1781 smallpox, even though it was not documented, obviously, but oral history has told us that it was extremely devastating. Supposedly, from an oral history perspective, we lost anywhere from 70 to 80% or even higher than that of the Mandans and more of the Hidatsas. And of course, we lost more than that in 1837. And so after the 1781 smallpox, by the time you hit 1833, the tribes were coming back pretty good. The tribes had always been known as the hub of the trading network among the Northern Plains tribes. And one of our best items to trade was the Knife River Flint. And that went as far away as the East Coast. It went as far as Texas. It went, some say it even reached California. So it went to all parts of what is now North America in the trade systems. And it wasn't only the trade that was very strong. The families were getting strong as well. Again, understanding that when the first smallpox hit, in some cases, a whole lodge would die off. Lodge containing the entire family. Lodge containing anywhere from probably 10 to over 20 people in some cases. And this was devastating because smallpox was indiscriminate. It didn't just choose the ones that were young or the ones that were old or the ones that had no standing. It chose everybody. And so we lost a lot of our ways, traditional ways, when it comes to the medicines. And we lost, if you don't have the right to do something, if you don't have the right to sing a song, right to do a ceremony, even if you knew that song or knew that ceremony, you could not participate or you could not lead it because of that. And so we were redefining societies, we were redefining ceremonies, we were redefining the spirituality, if you will, and not inventing more, but making what we had stronger, making what we had come back again, and fasting more. And so Bodmer, when they came in there, and Bodmer and Maximilian, one of the best times that they had, I would imagine, was the wintertime. Because the wintertime is a time when you do sit and tell stories. It's a time when you teach. It's a time when grandpa and grandma, especially grandpas, talk all about what happened since the time of creation and sometimes even tell the creation story. So it's a time of high cultural value when it comes to the stories and information and passing tasks, if you will, from one generation to another. Even though that a lot of the early artists, including Bodmer, didn't really capture the entire village, meaning that he didn't capture the activities of the village, the women cooking, for example, or the women, some of the skinning was captured, but not all of it. And so he left a lot out by doing that. But when he was there, I would imagine it would have been just a joyful time. They would have had a good gardens, and in those days they had real nice gardens. They had, which we'll talk about a little bit here, but they had corn. We had about 11 to 13 varieties of corn and squashes, and so we had plenty to eat. And I would imagine they probably told Maximilian Bodmer the same thing that they told Lewis and Clark, and they said, if we go hungry, you go hungry. If we eat, you eat. The Mandan Hidatsas knew the advantageous systems of trade. They knew how to deal with the people. They knew how to make them feel welcome, but they also were such good traders in those days that a lot of the people left owing them something. I know we have a lot of stories about the Assiniboines coming down to us to trade in the fall and in the wintertime. And we've been so good to them that we would give them more than what they paid for, so they would have to come back. So we're the first ones to invent a company store, if you will. And so at that time, doing those 1833, it would have been a heyday. It would have been fantastic. There would have been stories. There would have been gatherings. There would have been practicing for different ceremonies. In real nice days, you would have had people on top of those earth lodges. You would have had old men up there. You would have had young men up there dressed in their finery, trying to promote themselves in the eyes of the young ladies that were walking around. And you also had every societies that would have been practicing. So it was just a hub of life. You would have had births. You would have had deaths. You would have had teachings. You would have had stories. You would have had songs. And just to imagine walking in that village, walking through those gates, walking through that palisade, if you will. And I tried to imagine the sounds, the songs, the smells, the smoke, the kids crying, the people walking, people laughing, people singing. It would have been absolutely tremendous. And I think that's what he saw. And I'm sure that's what added on to his enjoyment, if you will, of painting these individuals. And he was a I call him a science painter, which means that he really took good detail. And even some of the drawings that he did, for example, the winter scenes where you have the cottonwood trees or the earth lodges among the cottonwood trees, as you see, and that's very detailed. And so it would have been a hub of life. It would have been almost back to our peak. We would never get back to our peak as what we had before the 1781 smallpox. We would never reach that. We'll never reach that again. And so that's the sad part of it. The sad part of it also is the deaths that would occur. Even in days that we didn't have smallpox, if you had death, you put them up in scaffold burials, or if there were children in the wintertime, you put them in the earth lodge. They had burials in there, and so it was life, I guess is what we can say the best.
Thanks so much, Gerard. It sounds like Bodmer and Maximilian really just encountered this very rich culture at a really pivotal moment too. And I appreciate you sharing what this might have not just looked like, but sounded like and smelled like, all these important aspects that maybe don't come through in Bodmer's images, but do in Maximilian's journals, and then also supplemented with the stories that you grew up with.
Right. And one thing I forgot to mention also is that's a very important part of this, I think, in a way, as far as the sounds, would be the dogs. They had the beast of burden, of course, before the horses were that. They had dogs to carry the travois. And even after they got the horses, which they would have had it by this time, they still had a lot of dogs to pack wood, to bring them in. And one thing that I've always read when I read all these different journals I'm reading is that the dogs in their early journals, they say those dogs never barked, but they howled. And so that tells me that those dogs were probably part wolf. So they were huge. And a lot of people say that they were very, very big dogs, all owned by the women. Everything was owned by the women too. And that's one thing I forgot to say. And everything was owned by the women. The lodges were built and owned by the women. The gardens were owned by the women. Everything, the cooking, everything was owned by the women, for exception. Even the young colts were owned by the women. And so that would have made the big difference, I think, within the lodge itself and within the village itself.
Scott, as Gerard and Annika have shown, Bodmer's work is so beautifully associated with the Great Plains. However, your experience directing the Indigenous Studies Center at the Newberry Library in Chicago and their archive helped you to become familiar with the regional diversity that Bodmer depicted For instance, his images of Indiana and Illinois. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about his Midwestern images.
Well, thank you. I think it goes very much to what Gerard was saying about him being a scientific type of observer, but because he can do the most wonderful detail on a type of tree or a single animal. Like he does a beautiful little watercolor of a painted turtle, type of turtle found in fresh water there, which looks like it could perfectly well fit in as a scientific illustration in a textbook. But at the same time, his training back in Switzerland was in a type of picturesque landscape that was popular for travelers on their kind of grand tour in the late 18th, early 19th century. And they would buy these etchings of places they had themselves been, but didn't have the skill to render. So Bodmer and his brother produced some beautiful landscapes of the Mosel Valley region of Germany, where they had kind of set up shop. And it was probably there that he came to the attention of Prince Maximilian, because he was from this region as well. So there's an interesting combination when you look at those Midwestern landscapes of the picturesque, as the way he frames a scene, but also that incredible naturalist attention to detail. I think the other thing, what I find fortunate about those renderings, because a lot of those he did really during their downtime. As I said, there was this period over a month, I believe, where Maximilian was sick and recovering, and so Bodmer was out sketching, and they were in New Harmony, which you have a picture of here, and these wonderful little landscapes of what the early Midwest looked like under settler occupation. So what's missing, of course, is the landscape as it would have been lived in by native people. And here you've got to switch to different types of agriculture rather than indigenous intercropping. There's monocropping, and so you have these large cleared fields that are, of course, typical of today's Midwest. And they're just snapshots of a period of the place which would be little known to us visually from the 1830s, if you were to ask, because people weren't really drawn to it for landscape painting reasons. It's flat, and it's not quite the drama of the Rockies or the Missouri River and so on. But we have them, and as I said, they kind of hover in that space between naturalist, scientific illustration, and picturesque European presentation of landscape. And I can't think of a competing, set of images we have of that region, especially along, say, the Wabash River and down by New Harmony, than those images from Bodmer.
Thank you, Scott. The image, if we could go back to the Wabash and Fox River confluence, this is by far one of my favorite Bodmer images, maybe because I grew up in the Midwest and I'm from Chicago and that area in particular. So I just, I like to think about what it was like for Bodmer to encounter these different climates and landscapes, going from the Midwest, a very water rich area, and then going to other places where it's more semi-arid, not as lush. And obviously this is a winter scene of the confluence of these two rivers, but he really captures well the different plant life and natural scenery. Either this is early in the morning or it's sunset along this river. And so I love his different depictions of the landscape and the different environments that he's encountering.
I remember with this image in particular, when someone said, "Oh, he was trying to make it look so exotic with all those vines." And I thought, if you're from the area, there are plenty of vines on trees, and in the winter they have that spooky effect because they're all without their leaves, and so that it looks like draped in some kind of Gothic horror type of thing. But I thought, no, he is depicting what he sees, and that is what that thickety underbrush along a river in Indiana is going to look like in the winter. So, he didn't need to make anything exotic. It was what it was.
Mm-hmm. This is so interesting. I'm also from the Midwest, so we all have an interest in these images. And, they really change, of course, as Bodmer travels up the river. He's painting from a steamboat most of the time. So the majority of the works in Joslyn's collection are river views. But of course, once he hits St. Louis and then gets further north into Omaha, the focus is very much on portraits of different individuals from Native communities in those regions. And building on this conversation about Bodmer's precision and just his role as an artist observer, I wanted to draw attention to the robes that are in these portraits. You both mentioned buffalo hide robes in your catalog contributions, and in different ways. So I'm curious to hear each of you speak about the importance of buffalo robes, which men and women wear in several different portraits, as well as to how they speak to identity and to the relationship that existed between the travelers and the men and women they encountered. A number of these robes still exist today in German collections, so it also affords an opportunity to reflect on Bodmer's portraits. So I'll leave it at that, but the buffalo robes in particular, I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts.
Well, I'll defer to Gerard to talk about their specific significance. Part of my interest is in their continued existence in these collections in Germany, so I can speak to that a little later.
Okay, thank you, Scott. The robes are again very, very fascinating to me, because one thing you have to understand is that the robes that were painted were not the only robes around there. Sometimes we look at that and say, oh man, they only had one robe or two robes or five robes or whatever, but robes were a part of life. And to me, this is what brings in, and in a way we're missing this in our conversation today, and that's the spirituality of everything. The tribes, the Mandans and Hidatsa, and all the tribes, I believe, depended on the spirituality for their existence. Everything had a spirit. And the buffalo was given to us to help us. The buffalo was given to us not only to provide a robe for blankets, for wear, for decoration, for ceremony, but it also gave us everything we need to live on. It gave us tools. It gave us obviously the meat. It gave us sinew to sew everything together. It gave us leg bones for scraping. And so it goes on and on. Even the hooves were used for glue. The horns were used not just as decoration, but they were used for spoons, and they were used for tools. And so then when they came to the robes, they were something special, because the women are the ones that tanned these hides. And that in itself was an incredible amount of work that we never hear about. I've had the opportunity to tan two buffalo hides, two brain tan buffalo hides myself, and it's a lot of work. You got to scrape everything off. You got to do it right, and it comes with a lot of prayer. It comes with a lot of respect, because you're working on a living animal. You're working on a living spirit. And so to take that hide and to transform it even to a higher importance, if you will, by putting your own design or your clan's design or a society design mixed with porcupine quills, mixed with other animals and natural dyes from the earth to make your decoration. Your decoration could be representations of the sunburst, representations of mountains, representations of where you come from or where your medicine comes from. And those were worn with pride. Those were worn during the ceremonies. As you could see with Bereditska Nuba, the Hidatsa man, he wears that with pride. He also wears that, I think, a little bit incorrectly, but that was Bodmer's doing. That was Bodmer's painting, because that robe should be around him, not just on one shoulder. But he's showing everything off, and so that's how he did. But mostly the robes were worn all the time. In the wintertime, obviously they're very, very warm. A lot of the robes were cut differently than what we do today. The robes at that time, a lot of them were cut down the back, and you would have half robes, and then they would sew them together sometimes to do that with. But the robes were extremely personal. They were extremely tribal. They were extremely ceremonial, and they were extremely practical. And so they hit all bases of that. And you would even see some robes most likely on and used as floor blankets, if you will, as mats. And so you had a lot of different uses. But first and foremost, and one thing we got to remember about the clothing and the robes is that it wasn't just an article. It was something alive. It was something that had spirit. It was something that helped you live from a spiritual basis to a physical basis. And so they took care of those robes. They just didn't throw them on the floor if they were wearing them. They put them in sacred places. They put them in real nice places within the Earth Lodge. And of course, as I mentioned before, the Earth Lodge was alive, so everything had a place for it. And so I could imagine walking around with the robe and a little bit of breeze, and it's nice and warm. And even I myself, I've camped out in an Earth Lodge that I built years ago. I camped out when it was around 45 to 50 below, and that's not wind chill factor. And all we used was robes. Me and a guy by the name of Dayton Duncan, we put in there and just about froze him. But there was ways to do it. My mom told me that there's little tricks, even when you're sleeping with the robe. Because if you put a robe around you and roll up in it, you're going to get cold. And the reason you're going to get cold is because your feet are open. And so my mom always tell me, when you use that robe, she said, make sure that you double it on your feet. That way the air can't get into it and get cold. And so there was little tricks. There's all kinds of little hidden things that we don't realize today, or we didn't realize at that time when we look at his paintings. And so the robes were not only beautiful, extremely beautiful, and the craftsmanship was fantastic. But the thing we have to remember is that they were alive and they had a spirit, and we utilize that for existence.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I love that idea of them as living beings that are part of your community. They're part of your lodges. They're part of your lives. This robe that you're looking at right now, by a Lakota artist, in art history, when one studies these materials from native communities of the plains, it's usually taught that among many, not all nations, but among many nations in the plains, it was traditional that men used representational depictions, say, of horses or deeds in their lives and so on, and that women use these geometric abstract decorations like we see here on this robe. And scholars have come to call this type of design a box and border design, because it has this central geometric rectilinear box-like figure, and then the outlines that go around the edges. So this would be a classic box and border robe, beautiful and interesting enough in itself. But my interest in it was the fact that it was collected by Prince Maximilian and was from that trip, right, in the 1830s up the Missouri, and was also depicted being worn by Bodmer in one of his watercolors, and the kind of connection between the thing itself as a still extant, hopefully living object, and the image, that seeing it being used, wrapped around a young woman and you can clearly make out from Bodmer's depiction that this is the same robe. And what would happen is Prince Maximilian would often try to barter, buy whatever, what objects he could to take back, because he was not only going on this journey and keeping a journal and hiring an illustrator, but he was also a material collector as well. So he's doing ethnographic collection. And, when you think of the wars that Germany has been through and all the opportunities over history for this object to have been destroyed, and the fact that it lives on in the Linden Museum in Stuttgart, that you could go see it as soon as the museums open up again. But whenever I look at the Bodmer portrait of the woman wearing it, and to see the detail and his care, it also makes me realize how attentive he was to native artistry. And sometimes you really get that in. There's a moment with the great early Renaissance Albrecht Dürer as an artist when he sees all this Aztec art looted basically by the Spanish and brought and put on display in Europe, and he's amazed at the quality of the art. He just says it's like nothing he's seen. It's an aesthetic he doesn't understand, but he knows it's beautiful and powerful. And I think there's something of that in Bodmer as this young man. He's trained in a certain way. He knows European fine art, but now he's encountering Native American fine art. And I feel like he gets it, he appreciates it. And that, I find that moving, and I find it part of what I love about Bodmer's work is that attention to native artistry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That is just so fascinating. And it really is remarkable that we can see the robes side by side with the images and draw out some of the conversations that, both of you have been having about, I guess, about Bodmer's attention to detail and what those relationships look like when he's painting somebody in their robe. I appreciate both of your answers. I'll hand it over to Patricia.
Thanks, Annika. Speaking of detail, I'd like to touch a little bit more on some of the details in Maximilian's journals. And these are some of the points that Gerard spoke about earlier. Maximilian's journals are rich with references to foods that were cultivated by the Mandan and Hidatsa, as well as other communities, including squash, pumpkins, wild onions, berries, and even beaver. So I'm wondering, Gerard, can you say a little bit more about the food and the sustenance and the various practices of the Mandan Hidatsa during Bodmer's time?
You bet. Thank you. Let me talk about the gardens first of all. And as I mentioned before, the gardens were extremely important to the people, to the families, and to the villages, and to the trade. The gardens were owned by the women, and they were taken care of by the women. They were taken care of by the young children, and they were taken care of by the old men. Traditionally, the gardens come from I guess we can call her one of our spiritual heroes, is the old lady who never dies, Mardetash. And her traditional garden was helped out by the white-tailed deer, by the black-tailed deer, and different stories, meaning different animals, would bring us different seeds and show us how to plant. We do know that there is a connection to the geese, because the geese fly south and come back in the fall and come back north in the spring. And it is known that the geese take the corn spirits back with them in the south to survive, and they come back again in the spring. They say that the gardens that we had in the villages were larger than football fields, and some of them were a lot of corn, but some of them had everything else. They had obviously all the beans. They had corn, squash, sunflowers, and of course, then the wild things. But with the gardens themselves, they would have areas probably as cultivated, as big as football fields, but they would have them marked off by families. They would use rocks to mark off their little plots. A lot of times, like if you look at Mahiriwia is the Buffalo Bird woman who wrote a very good book with Gilbert Wilson in 1930s or 1911, I guess, on the gardens. And she explained it all. She explained when her gardens were like most gardens would have sunflowers on the outside, circling around the garden. The sunflowers were the black sunflowers, the white sunflowers, yellow sunflowers, and the red sunflowers. And I think nowadays we have gray and black primarily. They had a lot of corn, but again, you have to be careful for cross-pollination. And so I'm working on right now, I have a garden myself, but I'm working on a system where I'm trying to find out how they prevented cross-pollination on a large scale back in those days. Nowadays, we can know enough to cover our pollen and all that business. But I know when if the corn got mixed up and you had some red in your yellow corn, they would call them the visitors. And so what that means is that it wasn't just a garden they planted. It was a garden like everything else that we've been talking about today, that everything was alive, that all these seeds had spirits. And all the things that were coming up, especially the corn, especially the squash, and especially the beans, coming up in the gardens would be treated from the owner would be treated like her children. I can remember when we were young, when my mom put in the garden, she'd go out there in the evenings and she would either sing to them sometimes, or she would talk to them, or she would pray to them. And it was just the way it was. She was talking to them like children, helping them grow. And they paid very much attention to that. And everybody would take part. Like I said, the old people, the young children, the ladies, and of course the young girls would all take part. And people had the ownership to plant the gardens. You had to have the right. And man could not help out. I mean, you couldn't sing the songs, you couldn't pray because that's a woman's job. And so the gardens were taken care of all the time. They even built scaffolds so people can sit up there and watch and keep the birds away. And that's what the little boys were good for. Grandpa could make them a little bow and arrow, and they would go out there and they would hunt. I remember my dad saying that when he was real young, he would go out, he would hunt, and he would bring back maybe a little sparrow he killed or something within the gardens. He would bring it back to his grandma, my great grandma, and she would praise him for it. Just praise him. He would call him the warrior and call him that he was the best warrior around and so forth. And then when the corn was done, to explain how this is alive and how this is spiritual, when the corn was we're ready to harvest, she would put a pile of corn in one end of the field and put a red cloth on it. And she would have my dad come and he would dance around that. He said that he would have to dance around it 4 times. And on the 4th time, he would jump over it, come back around, and act like he was cutting that red cloth off the top of that corn pile. So, looks like cutting a scalp off. He would then take it and give it to his grandma, and his grandma would take him, that cloth, and a brand new bucket and go into the cottonwood trees. And that's where she would leave it as an offering. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to understand that everything, as I keep saying, everything was connected. It wasn't just the garden. It wasn't just that land where the garden sat. It was the trees around. It was the environment. It was having the clans pray and ask for the rain from the thunderbirds. And so everything was connected. Everybody had to pay attention to that garden. That was their way of life. If the garden didn't produce, they had a drought or whatever, they suffered. They went without food in a lot of cases. And so, but to add on to that garden experience, if you will, then they had a tremendous amount of wild things that they would, plants and berries and everything from your wild potatoes or turnips, Indian potatoes they called them. From that, wild onions and a multitude of everything by the river, because the river was our backbone. The river was life, and so everything was there. And so the gardens, if your village starts failing in the future, that means your gardens were failing. It means you had no more. And when the government put us on reservations and start dealing with all that, our gardens went away. And that was almost, if you will, a last straw for us to watch those gardens leave. But we're bringing them back, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, that was the gardens. That they were sacred, they were alive, and that's what people need to understand, is that those gardens were alive. If you go that in the evenings when the corn was ready to go and the husks were going, and you could sit there, even to this day when I go to my garden, you could sit there and everything is up. You can hear the wind come through. You can hear the cottonwood trees down below rustling. You can hear them singing. You can hear them talking. And I often wonder, and those of us that have gardens today can go there right now, and in the fall, that is when it's good going, and sit there. And I'm wondering if we can hear the same sounds that Bodmer heard. I wonder if we can feel the same feelings he felt when he was by the gardens. And so to me, the gardens are extremely important, and they're extremely important today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gerard. I think, everything you shared with us is just really beautiful and provides a lot of insight into the life that Bodmer and Maximilian encountered, but that maybe doesn't show up in their images and in Maximilian's journals. I think there's a lot that's missing from the corpus of watercolors and from the journals. And so I want to close out a conversation with a question for the two of you, which is, what is the relevance of Bodmer's watercolors today? And I want to start off with a question for Scott. Bodmer's scholarship, I think, has been very westward facing. And I'm wondering, in speaking to the relevance of Bodmer today, if you can elaborate a little bit on how we might see interpretations of Bodmer shift, what you think hasn't happened, what needs to happen, and what are some of the ways that we can look at these images that we all need to take with a grain of salt. What are some of the ways we can look at them more critically?
Right. Thank you. It's a big question, and in part it's answered by what Gerard just so beautifully spelled out, which cannot be conveyed in a visual image. Right. The interconnectedness of all human activity within a community or a nation, the aura of significance that surrounds even the most quotidian task, that there's a very thin membrane dividing that seemingly workaday task from the world of the sacred. In fact, that may be no separation at all in many cases. And these still images, these little snapshots, as it were, cannot convey that without the community's engagement. So I think what, as you know in your own scholarship, and what a lot of visual scholarship has to do, is make room for the oral traditions that survive around the related objects from the producer or source community, that these images should be sending us back to those communities to learn about them, rather than ever more, detail about Bodmer and Maximilian. They're agents, they're instruments of this, and I'm very thankful for Bodmer's skill at representation and so on. I still like to put him within the context of other earlier European artists and how they encounter Native people, stretching all the way back to a figure like John White, on the coast of the Carolinas in the late 1500s, also making these beautiful watercolors, or when he's, encountering people from the Arctic that have been brought as captives to Elizabethan England, how there's a larger conversation there, but none of that conversation is sufficient within a European framework. That the thing we must always do is take these as pointers, as guideposts that point us back to a source community. And that's where the real interesting information lies. And that's where the enriching, as I said, that notion of an aura of significance around every single thing, those things aren't legible to us from outside of the communities, right? And and I'm as outside of that as anyone else who's not Mandan, Hidatsa, or from one of the communities. I could tell you things about Haudenosaunee or Mohawk representation in art about us or depicting us. But I think what is wonderful about these watercolors is that they are beautifully detailed. They are so delicate and attractive and engaging that they might just be strong enough to make us make that extra step and talk to the communities about why these are such wonderful images and what they convey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that's so true. These are starting points for conversations that need to happen with communities. So Gerard, I'll ask you the final question, which is also about the relevance of these watercolors today. And, following Scott's comments, maybe you could speak a little bit about how you would see your own community engaging with these portraits and with this collection of images.
You bet. Thank you, Annika. The images that we see and that how it relates to our community nowadays is that my feeling is that we really never left those stories. We've gone, we as a people, especially the Northern Plains tribes and Mandan Hidatsas, we have gone through a whole lot of changes. And we tried to keep the stories going through the challenges of boarding schools. We tried to keep the oral history going through the challenges of organized religion and through the challenges of relocation. And I'm not talking just relocation to the reservations from our traditional homelands, but even after we got on reservations, they still try to relocate us to cities in the relocation programs. And so we've always, even though we've stepped a little bit away from these paintings and the history, we've never stepped entirely away from them because they were always there, even if we didn't know that, if you will. And now there is a push, which I'm very happy about the young people trying to get back to who they were, at least knowledgeable wise. We'll never go back to our, as I said before, we'll never go back to our villages. We may go back to a village concept, but we will never go back to villages that I know of unless something really goes crazy in this world. But speaking about that, if we do that, we have these images to help us. We have these images to really tell us what not only life was like, but what the people who wore those clothing were like and what they represented. And so I'm very positive, and I'm very excited that these are resurfacing, if you will. And I look forward to hopefully having this be presented more to the Mandan Hidatsa elders, and elders are we're changing now. When I was real young, I'm 67 years of age right now, so I was really young. I knew some of the true elders, I believe, in a way, that got to see some of the ceremonies. I got to experience the life before the dams. I got to experience a little bit of the village concepts. But as I said before, religion and organized education and so forth has taken us away from our traditional beliefs, or at least to me, they try to. But I think our elders were strong enough, and our people were strong enough to not let that ever go. Even though sometimes we had to be quiet, and we kept down about it because the government was on us. And now we have an opportunity to acknowledge the history again and start learning from the history again, and maybe even bringing back some of the ceremonies or religions that's lost. But we have to reconnect. And one of the ways to reconnect, and I've heard this before from some of the young folks back home, is by these prints, is by these pictures. And they can start studying. They can start studying the hairstyles. They can start studying the why do they cut their feathers like that? Why do they wear that? Why does he have that big eagle feather in his hand? What does that mean? And I think most of us know what that means, but we can keep it going for the future generations. And so these are extremely important. It's extremely important to understand who we were. It's extremely important to understand what we went through. And I think it's more important to have the understanding and realization that we never left, that we're still here. That we can still stand by that river when we might not be wearing that outfit anymore, but we're still there spiritually, we're still there physically, and we're still there for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard, Scott, and Annika, for such an engaging program, and also for your contributions to this very special exhibition and catalog, which is so meaningful to many Native American and Indigenous communities, including my own, the Purépecha. It's been an absolute pleasure learning from all of you today. I'd also like to say thank you to our viewers. To learn more about the conversation we had today, you can visit Karl Bodmer, North American Portraits, on view in the Met's American Wing until July 25th. Thank you.